Good morning, Pathway. Welcome to our service today. I hope you're all doing well. As you can see, I'm recording from home today, changing things up a little bit. So I hope this goes smoothly. We'll see how it goes. And I hope that you all had a good week. We had an exciting event on a Saturday, and that's when Isabella and Javier got married. And so it was fun to celebrate with them as they start their journey of marriage, and it's been great to see their journey as they prepared for that. And I'm so excited. I'm just really so happy for them, and I wish them all the best as they embark on that journey. This is the last week of our sermon series that we've been doing on miracles. We've been calling it Do You Believe in Miracles? And so far, we've seen how Jesus healed a man who couldn't walk, how he fed the 5,000, and then last week we looked at how he calmed a storm. We've seen the wide range of ways that Jesus exercises divine power to help people, to heal, to deliver, and also to exert his control over nature, which is just some of the things we've seen so far. Today we're in Mark chapter 5. And this is the last week of our series, I said. So please read with me as we go to our last passage for this month. And I'm in Mark chapter 5, verse 21 to 43. Let me bring that up on our screen here. So please read along with me. Mark chapter 5, beginning in verse 21. When Jesus had again crossed over by boat to the other side of the lake, a large crowd gathered around him while he was by the lake. Then one of the synagogue leaders named Jairus came, and when he saw Jesus, he fell at his feet. He pleaded earnestly with him, "My little daughter is dying. Please come and put your hands on her so that she will be healed and live." So Jesus went with him. A large crowd followed and pressed around him, and a woman who was there who had been subject to bleeding for 12 years. She had suffered a great deal under the care of many doctors and had spent all she had. Yet instead of getting better, she grew worse. When she heard about Jesus, she came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak, because she thought, "If I just touch his clothes, I will be healed." Immediately her bleeding stopped, and she felt in her body that she was freed from her suffering. At once Jesus realized that power had gone out from him. He turned around in the crowd and asked, "Who touched my clothes?" "You can see the people crowding against you," his disciple answered, "and yet you can ask, 'Who touched me?'" But Jesus kept looking around to see who had done it. Then the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came and fell at his feet, and trembling with fear, told him the whole truth. He said to her, "Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace and be freed from your suffering." While Jesus was still speaking, some people came from the house of Jairus, a synagogue leader. "Your daughter's dead," they said. "Why bother the teacher anymore?" Overhearing what they said, Jesus told him, "Don't be afraid, just believe." He did not let anyone follow him except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. When they came to the house of the synagogue leader, Jesus saw a commotion with people crying and wailing loudly. He went in and said to them, "Why all this commotion and wailing? The child is not dead, but asleep." But they laughed at him. After he put them all out, he took the child's father and mother and the disciples who were with him and went in where the child was. He took her by the hand and said to her, "Talitha kum," which means, "Little girl, I say to you, get up." Immediately the girl stood up and began to walk around. She was 12 years old. At this, they were completely astonished. He gave strict orders not to let anyone know about this and told them to give her something to eat. I read an analogy this week of the ministry of Jesus, calling it the Jesus roller coaster. And I love roller coasters, and I thought that was a great analogy. If you imagine getting on a roller coaster, you get in at the beginning, and you get, there's all the preparation, you begin to take off, and you go up slowly, slowly, slowly. And if you think of the ministry of Jesus, he's born and he begins his public ministry when he's 30 years old, and he goes out. It starts off kind of slow. He gets baptized and he begins to call his disciples, begins to draw in followers, and things start to happen. He's teaching, he's healing people. Amazing things are happening. More and more people come. There's more miracles that happen, and it just goes on from there. It just takes off. There become huge multitudes and huge crowds that come in, and it's getting more exciting. There's more things happening. You're going higher, and then you reach the peak. just at the roller coaster, you get to that high point just before you go down. And in the ministry of Jesus, he reaches that peak in the what we call the transfiguration, when Jesus goes up on a mountain and he's changed and he's glowing in white, and he's with Elijah and Moses, the Jewish heroes of faith that come to talk to him. And there's just a few of the core disciples who are there, and God himself affirms, Jesus' role and that he's loved by God. And that's the high point. And from there, it's when it drops. And when you get to the top of the roller coaster and you just drop down, and then you go through the cycles from there. And Jesus' ministry changes after that moment. Jesus' ministry begins to take on a very different form. The crowds begin to leave when he starts teaching harder, weirder stuff. He talks about eating his flesh and drinking his blood. That doesn't go over too well. The rulers get more and more upset with him and begin to figure out how to shut him down. People, the crowds that used to be cheering and stampeding to find him eventually call for his execution, and Jesus is killed by the Romans. And that's the end of that phase of his ministry. And then there's the resurrection and a whole new part of the church, and a whole new section of history that starts after that. But there's that whole roller coaster that went through in the Gospels. And in our story, we're still at the early part. We're still early on when things are looking up. We're still going up that incline. People are pouring in. Things are exciting. Right before this story, Jesus healed a demon-possessed man. And now he's moving to something else. And the way Mark wrote his gospel, it's action-packed. It's fast-paced. It's full of detail. And he makes you feel like you were there. The way he writes it and the way he puts it across. Our story begins with the crowd around Jesus, as so many of the stories do. He's at a lake, there's a crowd around him, and then a Jewish leader comes up named Jairus, and he asks him to heal his daughter, who is sick. And on the way, Jesus is secretly touched by a woman in the crowd who's healed of a long-standing problem of bleeding. So as we look at this, and look at what's happening in this section, I've made a few observations. And here's the first one. Let me bring that up on our screen. It doesn't matter who you are. Mark likes to use a technique called sandwiching. And what that means is it's one story encased in the middle of another ongoing story. He does this several times. In different places in his gospel, and chapter 5 is one of them. So he begins with Jairus, but before the story of Jairus and his daughter is resolved, we're interrupted by the woman who touched him. So he could have chosen to write it just as one whole story. Jairus comes, he goes, he heals the daughter, and then he tells the story of the woman separately. But he chose to intertwine those two stories, and maybe that is exactly how it happened chronologically. But I think he intentionally merged these stories together, and I think he was trying to make certain points. And what I see in this story is how different the two main characters are. So one is a man, one is a woman, one is a leader, one is not, one is well accepted by society. The other is a woman who's bleeding and completely removed and isolated. We're told the name of the man, the synagogue leader, Jairus, who comes right up to ask for help. But we're never told the name of the woman. She's not named, and she has to sneak by to receive healing in the story. So in so many ways, they're opposite. One comes from a place of power, privilege, and authority. The other comes from the fringes of society, unseen and really unknown. But even though they're so different in so many ways, they do have a few key things in common. They were both in desperate need, and they both have tremendous faith in the power of Jesus to heal them. They know that just coming into contact with Jesus could be enough to heal them and to set them on a whole new path. Even though they seem very different, their need and their faith makes them equal in Jesus' eye. And Jesus responds to both of them, demonstrating that it just really doesn't matter who you are, and that he is open to anyone, and anyone has access to him. I've also noticed something else about the story, and I've noticed that the right touch can make a big difference. And I'll pull that up here. The right touch can make a big difference. And both of these two intertwined stories of healing involve touch. Jairus asked Jesus to come and put a hand on his daughter. That's what he asked for, so that she would be healed. He recognized that that was one of the components of healing. The woman's healing came when all she did was touch Jesus' cloak. That's all it took for her to be cured of her medical issue. And touch is extremely important in our lives. I spent some time looking up some of the studies that have been done on the value of touch, and there are so many. Did you know that worms, tiny worms, have been studied to see the role of touch in their size and growth? And apparently, even for worms that are just maybe a few millimeters or really small, the way they're born, whether they're born in isolation or they grow up in isolation, or whether they're born in a colony of like 30 or 40 worms, makes a difference for how large they grow and how healthy they are. For people, touch also makes a huge difference. And the value of touch has been measured for the health and the weight of babies. People have done those studies. And in many other social situations as well. Did you know that if a waitress touches you in the arm, you're more likely to give a bigger tip? And they've studied and measured that. Researchers who touched someone were more likely to be given a dime back if they left it in a phone booth and someone came across it. So there's that aspect of touch, they're more likely to give it back. It's been shown to increase the perception of honesty and confidence in a sales pitch. At least some of the time, more touch is better. According to one study, when you touch a person twice while making a request, they are more likely to agree. And they've measured that as well. Something else that I found very interesting is how much the experience of touch varies between different cultures. And if you listen to this that I read, research has found clear cultural differences in interpersonal touch. In one widely cited study, psychologist Sidney Gerard observed friends chatting next to each other in cafes across the world. He found a space of an hour, and people in Puerto Rico touch each other on average of 180 times in an hour. In Paris, it was 110 times. Go over to Florida, the average is twice an hour, 2 times in an hour. In London, the average is 0. So the difference in these different cultures is so tremendous between whether touching is normal or whether it's not. And in the U.S., it tends to be much less than a lot of other cultures, as you've probably observed. Now, all that was done and measured before COVID-19. And now touch is becoming something totally different. And it's now become taboo, basically dangerous. I mean, we're told to keep distance, not touch each other. And a few weeks ago, I was buying something at a store, and the guy at the counter, he touched my hand. And then he immediately apologized, said, "I'm sorry." And he just did it automatically. But he said, "Sorry, these are weird times." And before, it would have been a normal gesture. It wouldn't have been odd or anything that would have needed an apology before. But now it's different. Especially for those of us who are sheltering in place or don't have close family living nearby. We can become very starved for touch, for human contact, for the show of care, affection, and connection that it shows. And this is a very difficult season in terms of touch for many people. Now, of course, touch can also be used negatively. It can be used manipulatively. It can be used abusively. I'm sure many of us have experienced touch in a way that made you uncomfortable, whether it was being pushed in a crowd, somewhere like New York City in a subway or a bus or somewhere else, or even more negative forms of touch that can become manipulative and abusive. But even those negative aspects of touch highlight the power that touch has and the value that it has. So from our story, we see that both Jairus and the woman understood the power of positive touch. They understood the right touch can make a difference. And especially when that touch comes from Jesus. The woman who had been bleeding for 12 years would have been considered ceremonially unclean under the Jewish law. That entire period, every day of those 12 years that she was bleeding, she was unclean. She would have been called a azaba, literally an uzer, and was a threat and a scandal to anyone around her. Anyone she touched would have become unclean and would have had to have cleansed themselves. She would have been completely ostracized from public worship and the mainstream of any social function, being out at all. She would have been expected to remain in isolation, in quarantine for that entire time. In our story, she sneaked out to find Jesus, but she remains under the radar to avoid a big scene, only touching his cloak and then slipping away. And both her and Jairus' daughter experienced the power of what one touch with Jesus could bring. My final observation is this. My final observation is that desperate times call for desperate faith. Let me see if I can bring that up. That desperate times call for desperate faith. The woman who had been bleeding, she had limited options for healing. She had already spent all her money on doctors, and none of them had been able to help. If anything, the story says she'd gotten worse instead of getting better. She could have resigned herself to her situation. She could have given up. She could have owned her place in society as an outcast, but she didn't. Even though the illness had robbed her of 12 years of her life. When she heard about Jesus, she thought she had a chance to get her life back. And she was willing to take the risk. She was taking a big risk by being in the crowd. If the people around her found out she had a bleeding problem, they would have been upset. They would not have been happy. As I mentioned, all of them would have become unclean. They would have all had to go through rituals to cleanse themselves after any contact with her. So she was definitely not welcome in the crowd. But she was tired of being sick, and she was desperate enough that she didn't care what others would think. I find this woman's faith amazing. In the story, we're told that she said to herself, if I just touch his clothes, I will be made well. Because of the nature of her illness, she didn't want to call attention to herself by coming directly to Jesus. She didn't want even to touch Jesus himself. She certainly wasn't looking for Jesus to touch her. But she knew in her heart that the answer to her problem lay in an encounter with Jesus, and she was right. Jesus commended her faith and declared her free from her suffering. The story, I mentioned earlier the sandwich where her story comes in the middle, but it quickly turns back to Jairus, who gets a report that his daughter has died, that the situation has gotten worse. And they say, let Jesus go. Let's not bother him anymore. Don't bother the teacher. Healing is no longer necessary. Her story's done. She's gone. But thankfully, Jesus, he overheard the conversation, and he invites Jairus to hold on to the faith that brought him there in the first place. Jesus says, don't be afraid, only believe. Just believe. Sometimes we need that illogical, risky, desperate kind of faith. Sometimes, like the woman in the story, we need to risk exposing even our secret problem, even the problem that keeps us sequestered away, if it means there's a chance that Jesus, that God, will help us overcome them. Sometimes, like Jairus, we need to risk ridicule by believing that something is possible, even when there doesn't seem to be any way to achieve it, even when it seems like it's too far gone. And for pretty much any of us, death is that. Once someone's died, then that's it. But Jesus was able to reverse even the finality of that situation. The point in both stories is it's not so much the kind of miracle that people needed, but it's the kind of faith they had. It's not even ultimately about whether Jesus touched them or not. There are other places where he didn't even touch people to heal them. But it's about whether they believed that he had the power to change their circumstance. Jesus replaced their desperation with hope and with renewal. To review what we've seen, let me bring up the three things we've looked at. That it doesn't matter who you are. That the right touch can make a big difference, and that desperate times call for desperate faith. That's what God is able to do for us. If you're feeling desperate today, maybe that can be the turning point for a deeper encounter with Jesus. Maybe it's that desperation that will bring you to experience God's power, maybe for the first time. Maybe for the first time in a long time. If that's where you've been, if this has been a desperate season for you, then I hope that you can find that faith. I hope that you can dig deep and you can pull out just the courage to step out and to ask Jesus to make a difference, to invite Jesus in and to ask Jesus to move you forward. As we close our series, I hope that your faith in what God can do has been renewed. You may have heard these stories before, you may have read them, you may have discussed them, but I hope that as we've looked at them again, you can build up your confidence and your trust in God. No matter what else comes our way, God is with us, and he can take us through in his power. Please pray with me. as we prepare to close. Dear Lord, I thank you for your power in the Gospels, for the ways that you did miracles, the ways that you healed people, the ways that you turned their lives around. For the woman who'd been bleeding, that you cured her, and you took away that problem, and you allowed her to live in peace, and you renewed her faith. For Jairus' daughter, you didn't even just heal her, but you actually brought her back from the dead. And you're able to bring us back from spiritual death. You're able to bring us back and to give us eternal life in you. That's the promise that we have. And I pray that we continue to grow in our faith, that for any of us who are in desperate situations, we can come to you, we can renew our belief, and that we can experience your power in us. We can experience a miracle. I pray that you would watch over us. I pray that you'd lead us in your will. And I pray that we would experience your power at work. I pray that you continue to provide for Pathway, continue to provide for each one of us. I do pray for health and for healing for all those who are unwell. And I pray that you would turn our situations around and continue to give us fresh eyes and fresh vision for all that you're doing. I look forward to the rest of 2020. What else is coming? And I pray that we can experience new frontiers together and with you. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen. Amen. I hope it's been a good month for you. I look forward to when we can do more connection in person. We've been hoping to reopen, but we've had to postpone given some of the changes that California and Alameda County have made. But we'll continue to look at what are our options for the months ahead of what can we do and how can we remain connected. Next month in August, I'll be taking some time off. So I'll see. I don't know exactly where we're going to go, but we'll maybe travel around California a little bit if we can, and do some getaways as a family. So I'm looking forward to that. Looking forward to some rest. And I invite you to come back next week because Pastor Paul Zimby will be sharing with us. That'll be very exciting. So please don't miss that. And then Pastor Bruce will also be sharing a few weeks in August as well. So lots to look forward to. I'll be coming back at the end of the month. So maybe a little bit before I connect with some of you. But I do wish you all the best and have a great week. God bless.